For 3 years, I lit candles for a family that never truly chose me. On my third forgotten birthday night, my mother left exactly one voicemail calling me the useless one. The next morning brought no apology, only urgent paperwork needing my signature to save my golden sister's gala. Flipping through those pages, I found a secret capable of destroying the empire they built on my name and silence. Soon, the useless one would be the only one standing. My name is Phoebe Carmichael. Tonight, I turned 31 years old. I made the reservation exactly 2 weeks ago, carefully selecting a popular rooftop restaurant overlooking the glowing skyline of Raleigh, North Carolina. It was a place that required a credit card hold and a firm commitment, a place I thought might finally be significant enough to anchor them. I had spent days imagining the scenario where my parents and my younger sister would actually walk through those heavy glass doors, scan the dimly lit dining room, and smile when they spotted me. I wanted to believe that this year would be different. I wanted to believe that after 3 consecutive years of missed milestones, they would finally choose to show up. Instead, I sat perfectly still in a velvet booth designed for 4. Across from me sat 3 meticulously set places, 3 polished silver forks, 3 pristine crystal water glasses, 3 empty chairs staring back at me like a silent, damning indictment. The waiter had stopped asking if I wanted to wait to order after the first hour passed. He simply brought me another glass of sparkling water, his eyes carefully avoiding mine, extending the quiet pity that strangers offer when they witness a quiet humiliation. In the center of the table rested a small, single-tier birthday cake I had ordered in advance. The dark chocolate frosting looked rich and heavy, but I had no appetite. I just watched the condensation slide down the sides of the untouched water glasses. The restaurant hummed with the vibrant energy of other people's lives. Laughter erupted from a large party in the corner. Couples leaned across small candlelit tables, sharing secrets and wine. I existed in a vacuum of silence, anchored only by the heavy weight of my phone sitting face up next to my plate. The screen remained completely dark. For hours, I willed it to light up. I waited for a text saying they were stuck in traffic. I waited for a rushed phone call apologizing for a late start. I waited for a generic social media notification, a quick message, anything that proved I existed in their minds. There was absolutely nothing. The silence was absolute. It was a physical weight pressing down on my chest, a reminder of the space I occupied in the Carmichael family hierarchy. When the waiter returned with the check, I paid the exorbitant bill, including the penalty fee for the 3 missing guests, and walked out into the cool night air. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of streetlights and empty intersections. I did not cry. Crying required a level of surprise, a sudden shock to the system. And the tragic truth was that I was not surprised. I was just profoundly tired. I walked into my quiet apartment, kicked off my shoes, and let myself fall onto the sofa in the dark. It was approaching midnight when I finally unlocked my phone. I opened an app, mindlessly scrolling, perhaps searching for a distraction. Instead, the algorithm delivered a flawless, high-resolution blow directly to my chest. The first image on my feed was my sister, Delaney Carmichael. She looked radiant, draped in a custom emerald gown, throwing her head back in a flawless, camera-ready laugh. She was standing in the center of a heavily decorated ballroom, attending an exclusive preview event for her upcoming charity gala. And there, standing proudly on either side of her, were my parents. My mother was fixing a stray lock of Delaney's hair, her face glowing with absolute adoration. My father had his arm firmly around Delaney's shoulders, projecting the image of a proud, unified patriarch. The caption mentioned a night of family and philanthropy. They had not forgotten my birthday. They had simply chosen a better offer. As I stared at the glowing screen, the phone vibrated violently in my hand. A notification popped up. It was a voicemail from my mother. A sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline hit my bloodstream. Part of me, the pathetic, hopeful child that still lived somewhere deep inside my ribs, thought she might be calling to apologize. Perhaps she saw the time, realized her mistake, and was calling to make amends. I pressed play and held the speaker to my ear. The background noise of the recording was loud, filled with clinking champagne flutes and classical music. My mother's voice cut through the elegant ambiance, sharp and irritated. She did not say hello. She did not say happy birthday. She sighed heavily into the microphone. "Phoebe, please stop being dramatic. Your sister has a massive launch this week, and we cannot be expected to drop everything just because you want to eat a piece of cake. Stop making everything about you. You always do this. You sit around waiting to be offended. Delaney actually has things going on. She is building something important. We are supporting her. You are the useless one in this family anyway, so stop trying to make us feel guilty." The recording clicked off. The abrupt silence of my apartment rushed back in. I sat on the sofa for a very long time, letting the words echo in the dark room. You are the useless one in this family anyway. She had said it casually, throwing the words out like a careless afterthought, a truth so universally accepted within our family dynamic that it required no filtering. I waited for the tears to come. I waited for the familiar wave of suffocating grief that usually followed these encounters, but it never arrived. Instead, I felt a strange, creeping numbness. It started in my fingertips and spread upward, freezing the hollow ache in my chest. Something fundamental shifted inside my mind. The fragile, desperate tether that had kept me hoping, accommodating, and bending over backward to earn their love simply snapped. It did not break with a loud noise. It just dissolved quietly into the night air. The desperate daughter who wanted her family to show up to her birthday was gone. She had gone completely cold. I stood up, walked to the kitchen, and poured the remains of the expensive champagne I had bought for myself down the drain. I went to sleep without setting an alarm, feeling entirely hollowed out, yet remarkably clear-headed. The sun rose the next morning, indifferent to the collapse of whatever loyalty I still had to my family. I woke up, brewed a strong cup of black coffee, and opened my laptop out of sheer habit. I was entirely emotionally detached, moving through the mechanics of a normal morning. I opened my personal email inbox. Right at the top of the screen sat a new message. It was not from my mother offering a sober apology, nor was it from my sister expressing regret. The sender was my father's assistant. The subject line was written in sharp, demanding urgency. Need your signature by noon. I opened the email. There was no greeting. The body of the message contained a single sentence instructing me to review and electronically sign the attached dossier to finalize the venue permits for Delaney's charity gala. The very same gala that had kept them occupied while I sat in front of an empty table. They had ignored my existence for an entire evening, dismissed my feelings as dramatic, branded me as the useless child, and yet, less than 12 hours later, they were demanding my legal signature to secure their shining moment. I stared at the blinking cursor. I stared at the attached file icon. I was the useless one. That was what my mother had decreed. Yet here was a stack of legal documents requiring the useless daughter's name to make their grand philanthropic dreams a reality. I took a slow, deep sip of my bitter coffee. The coldness from the night before settled permanently into my bones. I moved my mouse over the attachment and clicked download. Growing up in the Carmichael household meant learning your assigned function with brutal efficiency. There were two distinct roles available to the daughters of my parents, and these roles were rigidly enforced long before either of us was old enough to understand the script we were handed. Delaney was the exhibition piece. She was the pristine porcelain vase displayed prominently in the center of the living room, designed to catch the light, draw admiration from every guest who crossed our threshold, and serve as undeniable proof of our parents' success. I, however, was the plumbing hidden deep within the dark walls. I was entirely invisible, utterly ignored, until something broke and threatened to ruin the beautiful house. The division of affection was not a subtle, underlying current. It was a loud, undeniable fact, measurable in the extravagant displays of celebration my parents orchestrated exclusively for my younger sister. When Delaney turned 10, there was a massive carnival constructed in our backyard, complete with a rented vintage carousel, professional performers, and catered food stations. When she turned 16, My parents secured a sprawling country club pavilion, inviting 200 guests to marvel at an imported ice sculpture carved meticulously in her likeness. The high-resolution photographic evidence of these grand events lined the walls of our home, a continuous, glittering timeline of her golden existence. She was a child meant to be documented. My milestones, conversely, were handled with a distracted wave of a manicured hand. My birthdays were typically greeted with genuine, momentary surprise by my mother, followed quickly by rushed promises of a rain check. "We will take you out for a very nice dinner next week," she would say, her eyes already scanning her leather-bound planner for a much more pressing social engagement. But next week never arrived. Those promises dissolved into the background noise of our frantic lives, unredeemed and eventually forgotten entirely. If I ever gathered the courage to remind them, I was met with irritated sighs and lectures about how busy adults operated. After a few years, the humiliation of asking became heavier than the disappointment of being forgotten. I learned to let the days pass quietly, celebrating in the silent, unlit confines of my own bedroom without making a sound. To justify this glaring disparity without feeling like monsters, my parents constructed a highly convenient narrative. They labeled me the strong child. The word strong was their absolute favorite weapon, wielded not as a compliment of my character, but as a blanket absolution for their own chronic parental negligence. "You are so fiercely strong, Phoebe," my father would tell me, clapping a heavy hand on my shoulder as he walked out the door to attend Delaney's regional cheerleading competition, leaving me completely alone on a long holiday weekend. "You can handle things on your own. You do not need us hovering over you." It was a brilliant, devastating psychological manipulation. By declaring me naturally independent, they officially excused their constant absence. They convinced themselves, and their wealthy social circle, that my extreme self-reliance was a rare, innate maturity rather than a desperate survival mechanism built from years of abandonment. They did not have to parent me because I supposedly did not require parenting. I was a self-sustaining organism, requiring neither water nor sunlight. This twisted philosophy extended violently into our financial realities. The Carmichael wealth was a carefully curated illusion, heavily leveraged and entirely focused on outward appearances. Funding Delaney was considered a necessary, non-negotiable investment in the family brand. Her teenage years were a sequence of incredibly expensive ballet academies, immersive summer theater camps in New York City, and private tutors hired at premium rates to ensure her grades matched her elevated social standing. On her 18th birthday, a brand new silver convertible appeared in our driveway with a massive red ribbon draped across the pristine windshield. Meanwhile, I spent my high school evenings navigating the labyrinth of financial aid forms and student loan applications. I hunted down obscure college scholarships, meticulously filling out endless paperwork in the dead of night. I worked 20 hours a week organizing dusty shelves at a local public library and picked up grueling weekend shifts at a crowded downtown diner just to cover the cost of my own advanced placement textbooks, my winter coats, and my standardized test fees. I learned to ruthlessly negotiate grant packages while my sister was downstairs debating which expensive shade of imported silk to drape across her canopy bed. If I ever asked for a fraction of assistance, I was reminded of my inherent strength and told that building character through hard work was a character-building privilege Delaney simply did not have the time to experience. Yet, the moment the polished veneer of the Carmichael family encountered a crack, the narrative aggressively shifted. Whenever they faced a bureaucratic nightmare or an administrative disaster that money alone could not instantly wave away, I was the first and only person summoned. I was their designated crisis manager, their unpaid family fixer. If a complicated medical insurance claim was denied, the massive stack of dense paperwork was shoved across the kitchen island toward me with a panicked demand to fix it. When my parents faced a terrifying tax audit because my father had recklessly mismanaged his business deductions to fund another of Delaney's expensive pageants, it was my eyes that spent 70 hours scanning decades of crumpled receipts to find their legal salvation. I spent countless nights deciphering legal jargon, disputing fraudulent credit card charges, and untangling the massive webs of liability they constantly spun around themselves. I was the one who negotiated with angry contractors when my mother stubbornly refused to pay for a minor landscaping flaw. I was the one who filed the convoluted police reports and insurance claims when Delaney managed to lose her designer jewelry in foreign countries. In those moments of sheer, unadulterated panic, I was suddenly indispensable. My strength was no longer an excuse to ignore me. It was the tool they needed to survive. My mother possessed a specific, cutting vocabulary for this sharp divide. She told her country club friends over expensive lunches that Delaney possessed a certain light, a radiant, undeniable energy that drew important people in and made our family look magnificent. Delaney was the bloom. Delaney was the legacy. I, conversely, was simply good at desk work. My mother would sigh softly, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet, and lament that I was entirely too dry and practical to ever make the family shine in public. I lacked the necessary sparkle. I was the dull, reliable machinery operating behind the heavy velvet curtain, entirely devoid of the charm required to elevate the Carmichael name. I was useful, certainly, but I was not something to be proud of. Over the course of 2 decades, I adapted to this cruel reality. Children are incredibly resilient creatures. We will contort our spines and shrink our souls to fit whatever shape of love is offered to us, even if that shape is agonizingly narrow and sharp. I learned early on that the only way to secure a safe place in my own home was to become utterly indispensable in the shadows. I transformed into the ultimate utility. I stopped asking for affection. I stopped causing friction. I stopped expecting them to show up to my university graduation ceremonies or my corporate award banquets. I silenced my own human needs so completely that my usefulness became my entire identity. I became a ghost who did their taxes. I was a phantom who shielded them from legal ruin. And because I never complained, because I always quietly fixed the broken things, balanced the bleeding ledgers, and absorbed the heavy impact of their mistakes, my family arrived at a deeply flawed, permanent conclusion. They fundamentally believed that no matter how severely they neglected me, no matter how casually they discarded my feelings, I would forever remain their obedient, silent shadow. They assumed my loyalty was a bottomless well, and that I would always be waiting in the dark, ready to clean up their mess without ever asking for a place in the light. The digital file attached to the email was massive, containing 142 densely packed pages of legal formatting. I dragged my mouse across the screen and clicked the icon, my eyes scanning the heavily structured index. The cover sheet displayed a sleek, minimalist logo for a newly formed philanthropic organization, boldly registered under my sister's name. It was positioned as a revolutionary foundation dedicated to urban renewal and community arts. I scrolled past the glowing mission statement and the beautifully written preamble, landing directly on the executive board directory. My breathing stopped entirely. There, printed in stark black lettering on the second line of the organizational hierarchy, was my full legal name. The official title assigned to me was Chief Treasurer. I sat motionless in the quiet of my apartment. I had never been consulted about the formation of this charity. I had never attended a single organizational meeting. Yet here I was, legally bound to the highest level of fiduciary responsibility for an entity I knew absolutely nothing about. A cold sense of dread began to pool in my stomach as I scrolled further down into the operational details. Page 12 outlined the primary physical headquarters for this grand endeavor. The address listed was not a newly leased corporate space. It was a historic, exposed brick industrial property known as Mercer Hall. The building had originally belonged to my grandmother, June Mercer. For over a decade, my parents had maintained a flawless, unified narrative that Mercer Hall had been liquidated shortly after her passing to cover mounting estate taxes and outstanding legal fees. I had genuinely mourned the loss of that beautiful, sunlit building, believing it to be a tragic casualty of financial necessity. Yet, staring back at me from the glowing screen was the undeniable proof that the property had never been sold to a third party. It had been secretly retained, hidden from my view, and was now being repurposed as the crown jewel of my sister's vanity project, The deeper I dug into the dense legal jargon, the more the air in my kitchen seemed to thin out. By page 47, the document shifted from organizational structure to binding financial commitments. It contained a dizzying array of vendor agreements secured for the upcoming launch gala. There were contracts for premium catering services, immersive floral installations, and custom lighting designs. The total costs were staggering, easily running into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Attached to these lavish agreements were aggressive lines of credit and massive cash advances demanded by the luxury suppliers. The guarantor listed for every single one of these exorbitant liabilities was me. My name was stamped across the bottom of multiple risk assumption waivers. Next to my printed name rested an electronic signature. It was an incredibly sophisticated piece of forgery. At a passing glance, the looping digital cursive perfectly mirrored my exact handwriting style. But I am a person whose entire professional life revolves around recognizing tiny catastrophic anomalies. I immediately noticed that the specific slant of the capital letter in my first name was slightly too sharp. More damningly, the digital timestamp and the verification routing code attached to the signature block did not originate from my personal devices. The verification trail led directly to an administrative terminal located inside my father's downtown corporate office. They had not merely volunteered my reputation, they had actively manufactured my legal consent to underwrite a potential financial catastrophe. A sharp metallic taste coated the back of my throat as I reached the itemized budget breakdown. It was a masterpiece of creative accounting and aggressive embezzlement. There were massive, unusually inflated line items, categorized under incredibly vague descriptions like strategic community outreach and brand synergy consulting. The projected payouts for these ambiguous services were enormous, designed to bleed the nonprofit accounts dry before the doors even officially opened. I took the vendor identification numbers listed in the margins and cross-referenced them against the public state registry database. Two of the highest-paid consulting firms were obscure holding entities I recognized instantly. They were corporate shells my father had established years ago for commercial real estate acquisitions that had ultimately failed. The charity was not a philanthropic endeavor in any sense of the word. It was a highly orchestrated funnel, purposefully designed to siphon tax-exempt donor money directly into my father's sinking business accounts, all while legally positioning me as the primary officer holding the corrupted purse strings. Then came the visual presentations. Page 89 displayed a series of high-resolution architectural renderings proposing the interior renovation of Mercer Hall. I pushed my chair back from the table, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. The glossy images showed a sprawling, open-concept community center. There were designated zones specifically drafted for local artisans, a youth mentorship workshop bathed in natural skylight, and a communal gallery space featuring suspended industrial track lighting. I recognized every single inch of these designs. I recognized them because I was the one who had drawn them. 7 years ago, I had spent 5 straight months meticulously drafting a comprehensive proposal for a community arts initiative. I had poured my entire heart into a vision I desperately hoped to build. In a rare moment of vulnerability, I had shown the thick binder to my mother, seeking a tiny shred of parental encouragement. She had casually dismissed the entire concept as a naive pipe dream, telling me to focus on my practical desk job and stop wasting time on childish fantasies. Now, my deeply personal vision had been scraped entirely clean of my identity. The slick marketing copy accompanying the renderings boldly proclaimed that this revolutionary community concept was the exclusive, brilliant brainchild of my sister. They had stolen my dream, stripped off my name, and repackaged it to secure her social elevation. The final section of the dossier cemented their ultimate cruelty. It was a comprehensive public relations strategy outlining a massive media campaign built entirely on the concept of preserving our family legacy. There were scripted talking points detailing generations of strong women giving back to the city. The narrative was beautifully woven to extract maximum emotional resonance from wealthy donors, but it featured a glaring, deliberate omission. My name was completely scrubbed from every single public-facing story. I was engineered to be the silent, legal scapegoat, the forged signature carrying 100% of the financial and legal risk, while my sister stepped into the brilliant spotlight to accept the awards, the accolades, and the adoration of the elite. I was the invisible beast of burden, chained in the dark, forced to carry the crushing weight of their glittering temple. A normal person might have shattered in that moment. A normal daughter might have screamed, hurled her coffee mug against the wall, or picked up the phone to unleash a torrent of agonizing betrayal upon the people who shared her blood. I did none of those things. The betrayal was far too absolute, the deception far too structural, for a simple, messy emotional outburst. The cold, mechanical part of my brain, the exact part they had trained for decades to silently fix their disasters, cleanly and completely detached from the wounded daughter inside me, I did not shed a single tear. I did not draft an angry text message. I simply adjusted my posture in the quiet room. I opened a new, highly secured browser window on my laptop. I pulled up the county property tax records database. I logged into the state corporate registry. I began accessing archived email servers, requesting deep historical data on property transfers, and downloading years of digital communication history. I was no longer an ignored family member waiting desperately for an invitation to their table. I was an auditor, and I was about to meticulously dismantle their entire empire. I sent a brief, uncompromising email to my managing director at Hearthline Civic Advisory, stating I was taking immediate personal leave for the next 72 hours. I did not provide an explanation, and given my flawless attendance record over the past 6 years, none was demanded. My role as a senior compliance analyst was not merely a job, it was a highly specialized lens through which I viewed the world. My daily professional existence revolved around dissecting bloated municipal contracts, untangling sophisticated corporate fraud, and ensuring that heavily regulated entities adhered strictly to the absolute letter of the law. I spent my days hunting down discrepancies hidden deep within thousands of pages of financial disclosures. People who manipulate legal structures are fundamentally arrogant creatures. They inherently believe that their cleverness makes them invisible, relying heavily on the assumption that investigators will eventually succumb to fatigue. They bank on the hope that no one actually wants to read page 400 of a zoning addendum. But they were wrong. I always read the final page. I cleared away the remnants of my normal life, wiping down the cheap laminate surface of my small dining table to establish a pristine perimeter. I brought out my secondary work laptop, a stack of wide-ruled legal pads, a box of black ink pens, and a fresh pot of dark roast coffee. My dining room was instantly transformed into a private forensic accounting station. The profound numbness that had settled over me the previous night had completely crystallized into a razor-sharp, analytical focus. I was no longer an unloved daughter searching for validation. I was an auditor examining a hostile entity, and I knew exactly how to find the structural fractures in their lies. The first thread I pulled was the physical asset itself. I bypassed the standard search engines and logged directly into the county clerk property records database, a system I navigated daily for my corporate clients. I entered the precise parcel identification number for Mercer Hall. For over a decade, my parents had maintained a unified, tragic narrative that the historic brick building had been sold to an anonymous commercial developer to settle the mounting estate taxes following my grandmother June's passing. The official state registry told a brutally different story. There had never been a sale. There was no third-party developer. Instead, exactly 7 months after my grandmother died, the property deed was quietly and swiftly transferred via a quitclaim deed. The receiving entity was not a buyer, but a newly formed legal umbrella named the Carmichael Family Revocable Trust. The transfer documentation was incredibly sloppy. Bearing the stamp of a discount strip mall notary my father frequently utilized for his lower-level real estate flips. It was a classic shell game maneuver. They had intentionally hidden the asset from public scrutiny while retaining absolute unilateral control over its substantial equity. To understand the exact parameters of that control, I needed the foundational trust documents. Tracking those down required bypassing my family entirely and accessing the state probate court archives. I pulled the unsealed public filings connected to Grandmother June's original will. Buried deep within the heavy boilerplate text, far past the standard distribution clauses, was a specific, heavily notarized addendum. I scrolled slowly, my eyes scanning the dense legal phrasing until the letters of my own name materialized on the screen. The clause was entirely unambiguous. It explicitly dictated that upon reaching the age of 30, I was to be automatically elevated to the position of successor co-trustee of the estate. The legal language further stipulated that any structural modifications, financial encumbrances, or transfer of ownership regarding Mercer Hall required my direct, legally binding, written approval. I sat back in my chair, the plastic wheels squeaking sharply against the hardwood floor. I was 31 years old. For an entire year, I had possessed absolute legal authority over that building. My parents had known this. They had deliberately concealed my own power from me, operating a shadow trust because they knew my grandmother had intentionally placed a heavy lock on her legacy and handed me the only key. If they were risking criminal fraud to hide my authority, they were doing it for a very expensive reason. I shifted my focus to the financial encumbrances listed against the property deed. Mercer Hall was not sitting dormant. It was bleeding cash. 3 years ago, a massive commercial mortgage had been taken out against the equity of the historic property. The principal loan amount was staggering, pushing close to $2 million. I traced the loan origination number through the state banking registry, following the digital routing codes to see exactly where that massive injection of capital had landed. The funds did not go toward property maintenance, community development, or structural repairs. The money was funneled directly into a corporate holding account registered exclusively to Delaney. I vividly remembered that specific timeline. It was the exact year my sister had launched an incredibly pretentious, aggressively marketed lifestyle brand that sold imported linen napkins and curated wellness crystals. The brand had spectacularly imploded within 8 months, leaving a humiliating trail of unpaid luxury suppliers and heavily mocked promotional videos. My parents had secretly mortgaged my grandmother's legacy to quietly bail Delaney out of commercial bankruptcy. Now, heavily burdened by that crushing debt and facing foreclosure, they were desperately attempting to rebrand the failed warehouse space into a tax-exempt community charity to wash the financial stains away using donor money. To execute this massive, fraudulent pivot, they needed a compliant board of directors to legitimize the charity on paper. I accessed the internal portal of the newly formed nonprofit organization, utilizing the very administrative credentials my father's assistant had carelessly left active on the document routing system. I downloaded the official meeting minutes for the past 6 months. Reading them was a surreal experience, like reading a fictional novel featuring myself as a highly active supporting character. According to the typed corporate records, I had attended a strategic planning session on the second Tuesday of October. I had supposedly seconded a critical motion to approve the gala budget on the 14th of November. I was officially documented as giving enthusiastic vocal support for Delaney's appointment as the executive director during a sudden emergency board meeting in late January. I was a phantom executive, dutifully raising my hand in rooms I had never entered, silently endorsing the theft of my own inheritance. They had forged my presence at every single critical juncture to satisfy the state nonprofit compliance regulations. The final revelation, however, was the one that truly severed the last remaining microscopic thread of my familial loyalty. While digging deep inside the probate filings, I noticed a secondary account linked to Grandmother June's estate. It was an educational trust fund, explicitly established and designed to be divided completely equally between Delaney and me. The instructions were crystal clear. 50% was allocated for my academic pursuits, and 50% for hers. I pulled the historical bank statements from the corresponding financial institution, tracing the ledger back over a decade. The withdrawals began when I was a college freshman. Massive, incredibly uneven distributions had been authorized by my father, acting as the primary executor of the account. While I was taking out high-interest private student loans, working 20 hours a week at a dusty library, and eating cheap noodles to survive, thousands of dollars from my half of the fund were being systematically siphoned off. I cross-referenced the withdrawal dates with my family's social media history. My educational funds had been used to pay for Delaney's private acting coaches in Los Angeles, her luxury apartment security deposits, and her extended summer excursions across Europe. They had not just ignored my struggles. They had actively orchestrated them. They had funded her extravagant existence with the very money intended to keep me from drowning. I closed the laptop screen. The audit was complete. I knew exactly what they had done, and more importantly, I knew exactly how to tear it all down. I did not reach out to a sympathetic friend to cry over a cup of tea. Emotional validation was a luxury I could not afford, and frankly, a weeping session would only drain the cold energy I needed to dismantle their operation. Instead, my first phone call was to a woman my parents had actively banished from our lives nearly a decade ago. I dialed the landline of my great-aunt Lorraine Mercer, the younger sister of my late grandmother June. For years, my mother had painted Lorraine as a deeply difficult, combative old woman who harbored irrational grievances about the past. Whenever Lorraine's name was mentioned, my father would roll his eyes and dismiss her as a bitter relic who simply could not accept how modern families operated. I now understood perfectly well that in the Carmichael household, being labeled difficult simply meant you refused to be manipulated. Lorraine answered the phone on the fourth ring. Her voice was raspy but entirely alert. I did not waste time on pleasantries. I laid out the bare facts of what I had discovered over the past 48 hours. I told her about the forged digital signatures, the hidden trust addendum, and the staggering commercial debt tied to the family property. Lorraine did not gasp. She did not offer me hollow pity. She simply let out a low, knowing sound. She told me she had always suspected my father was playing an incredibly dangerous financial game the moment June passed away. Furthermore, she revealed a secret that made my heart hammer against my ribs. Knowing my parents' penchant for destroying inconvenient truths, Lorraine had quietly hired her own attorney years ago to secure certified, notarized copies of every single original document related to the building before my father took over the estate administration. She had been waiting for the day the house of cards collapsed, and she had kept the matches perfectly dry. Early the very next morning, Lorraine and I walked into Naomi Pike's glass-walled downtown office. Naomi was a premier estate litigation attorney who commanded a fearsome reputation in the city. She was a strikingly sharp woman of very few words, dressed in an immaculate dark suit, possessing a cold, calculating gaze that missed absolutely nothing. We sat in her expansive conference room, and I slid the thick binders of evidence I had meticulously assembled across the polished mahogany table. I presented the timeline, the conflicting deeds, the forged vendor contracts, and the fraudulent board meeting minutes. Naomi spent 2 solid hours reviewing the paperwork in absolute silence. The only sound in the room was the sharp turning of pages and the soft ticking of a heavy brass clock on the wall. When she finally looked up, her assessment was swift and devastatingly precise. She mapped out my family's immediate legal exposure with the clinical detachment of a surgeon identifying a tumor. She stated that we were looking at multiple counts of fraudulent trust declarations, gross financial misrepresentation to philanthropic organizations, and the severe criminal use of my identity to secure massive commercial credit lines. This was not a simple family misunderstanding. It was a highly organized corporate crime. Naomi folded her hands on the desk and gave me my strict operational directives. If we wanted to trap them completely, I had to suppress every single human instinct I possessed. There would be no dramatic social media posts vaguely alluding to family betrayal. There would be no tearful, screaming confrontations in my parents' grand living room. I was strictly forbidden from giving them even a single second of advance warning. If they sensed I knew the truth, my father would immediately begin shredding documents, moving funds into offshore holding accounts, and spinning a new, sympathetic narrative portraying me as an unstable, jealous sister trying to ruin a charity event. We had to let them continue building their beautiful, fraudulent ship, and we would simply pull the plug while they were sailing in deep water. Following Naomi's exact legal instructions, I returned to my apartment and initiated a silent, invisible lockdown. I spent the entire afternoon drafting formal legal holds. I sent severe preservation notices via registered overnight mail to the regional bank holding the commercial mortgage, the corporate insurance firm underwriting the massive upcoming gala, and the independent legal counsel representing the charity board of directors. These notices were legally binding directives that forced these institutions to freeze and retain every single email, internal memo, financial transfer, and signed contract related to the event. If a single document disappeared after these notices were received, the institutions themselves would be held liable for destruction of evidence. I was building an iron cage around my family's lies, and the banks were helping me lock the doors. Next, I systematically targeted their operational supply chain. I logged into the centralized third-party vendor portals used by the Gala Planning Committee. I located the specific administrative profiles that had been utilizing my forged digital signature to approve exorbitant catering and floral invoices. With a few deliberate keystrokes, I permanently revoked all authorization access associated with my name. I triggered a high-level security protocol within the system, filing a formal dispute that demanded manual, in-person identity verification for any future financial authorizations attempting to use my credentials. The invisible machinery they had confidently relied upon to fund their extravagant party was now completely paralyzed. The vendors would soon start demanding real money, and the fake signatures would no longer work. While I was quietly closing the traps from the outside, a subtle, highly dangerous shift was already occurring from within the charity board itself. Arthur Penhaligon was an elderly, highly respected philanthropist who served as the primary anchor donor for the foundation. He was a man who valued meticulous detail over flashy presentations. I knew Arthur. 7 years ago, long before this fake charity existed, I had sat next to him at a deeply tedious civic luncheon, over a plate of dry chicken. I had passionately described my vision for a community arts center. I had even sketched the exact floor plan, detailing the youth mentorship workshops and the communal gallery, on a white linen napkin for him. Now, Arthur was sitting in strategy meetings, reviewing the glossy promotional materials for the upcoming gala. As he listened to Delaney confidently deliver her memorized speeches, claiming the entire community concept was her own sudden, brilliant inspiration, his sharp memory began to pull at the loose threads. He recognized the specific architectural zoning of the renderings. He remembered the layout I had drawn on that napkin. Arthur began asking very pointed, highly uncomfortable questions about the architectural timelines and the original sourcing of the project concepts. Delaney, unaccustomed to facing real scrutiny, offered stumbling, contradictory answers that only deepened his suspicions. The beautiful, unified narrative my family had sold to the city was already starting to fray at the very edges, and they had absolutely no idea that I was the one holding the scissors. The initial tremors of my invisible blockade reached my family's pristine fortress by Tuesday afternoon. The catering company and the venue insurance brokers must have made their frantic phone calls regarding the frozen authorizations. The reaction was immediate, perfectly predictable, and heavily layered with emotional manipulation. My phone rang at exactly 2 o'clock. The caller identification displayed my mother's cell number. I let it ring 3 times before sliding the green icon across the glass screen. I did not say hello. I simply pressed the device to my ear and breathed. My mother immediately launched into a theatrical performance of maternal distress. She was audibly weeping, her breath catching in her throat as she begged me to tell her what was wrong. She claimed the vendors were experiencing some ridiculous technical glitch, and that I just needed to log in and click a few buttons to fix a minor misunderstanding. She played the role of the overwhelmed, innocent matriarch perfectly. When her tears met absolutely zero resistance on my end, the performance abruptly ceased. The crying vanished instantly, replaced by a sharp, venomous sarcasm that I knew intimately. Her voice dropped an octave, hardening into a cruel sneer. She demanded to know why I was intentionally sabotaging my sister. She accused me of being pathologically jealous. She spat out that I had always resented Delaney for being beautiful, for being loved, for actually making something of her life while I sat alone in a sterile apartment pushing paper. She said my refusal to simply sign the vendor agreements was a pathetic, transparent attempt to steal the spotlight during the most important week of my sister's life. I remained entirely silent. My silence infuriated her more than any screaming match ever could. "Are you even listening to me?" she demanded, her breath hissing through the receiver. "You are destroying this family over your own petty insecurities. Do you think anyone is going to applaud you for this? You are still the useless one. Phoebe, you always have been. And stunts like this just prove it to everyone." She slammed the phone down. The dial tone echoed in my ear. I calmly took a screenshot of the call duration and exported the automatic audio recording to my encrypted drive. Less than an hour later, my father called. He did not yell. My father never yelled. He simply occupied space until all the oxygen belonged to him. His tone was the cold, flat baritone of a corporate executive addressing a severely insubordinate employee. He did not mention the frozen accounts or the rejected electronic signatures. He bypassed the mechanical issues entirely and went straight for the structural foundation of my guilt. He told me I was threatening the reputation of the entire Carmichael family. He spoke of legacy, of community standing, of the absolute necessity of maintaining a unified front. He phrased his demands as absolute facts, stating that whatever childish tantrum I was currently throwing would end immediately. He instructed me to contact the insurance underwriters by 5 o'clock that evening to retract my preservation notices. He framed it not as a request, but as an inevitable return to the natural order of things. He told me that if I ruined this gala, the public humiliation would fall squarely on my shoulders, and that I would be permanently exiled from the family name. I let him finish his monologue, offered a quiet murmur of acknowledgement that committed me to absolutely nothing, and ended the call. His audio file joined my mother's in the secure folder. By evening, the aggressive frontal assaults shifted into a desperate, backdoor negotiation. My phone lit up with a rapid succession of text messages from Delaney. Her strategy was a chaotic mixture of pleading and bargaining, laced with a profound sense of entitlement. She did not apologize for stealing my architectural designs. She did not acknowledge the forged documents. Instead, she painted herself as a victim of circumstance, claiming she was under immense pressure and that the paperwork had just gotten incredibly messy. "Please, Phoebe, just cover for me this week," she wrote in a long, unbroken paragraph. "Just unlock the vendor portals so the decorators can start. I promise we will sit down the morning after the gala, and I will explain everything. I will even give you a public shout-out during my speech. Just do not do this to me right now. I have investors flying in. You cannot let me fail." She believed a vague promise of future explanation, and a single mention of my name on a stage would be enough to buy my legal compliance in a massive financial fraud. It was staggering how cheaply she valued my intelligence. I did not reply. I took meticulous screenshots of every single message, noting the exact timestamps. The psychological warfare escalated the following morning. I received a highly confidential text message from my cousin Marcus. He was one of the few extended relatives who had always seen through my parents' polished veneer, though he rarely had the courage to speak up publicly. Marcus warned me that the Carmichael damage control machine was already operating at maximum capacity. My parents had spent the entire evening making discreet phone calls to aunts, uncles, and key family friends. They were actively seeding a new, highly destructive narrative. According to their whispered rumors, I was suffering from a severe mental breakdown. They claimed my prolonged single status, my isolation, and my perceived romantic failures had finally pushed me into a state of deep instability. They were telling people that I was imagining legal slights, that I was confused about the family finances, and that I was lashing out in a desperate bid for attention. By painting me as a hysterical, lonely spinster losing her grip on reality, they were preemptively discrediting any truth I might attempt to expose. If I spoke out about the fraud, the community would merely shake their heads in pity, fully primed to believe I was simply crazy. Their brazen audacity did not stop at family gossip. Midday, my automated web alerts flagged a new upload on the charity's official domain. I accessed the site and found a newly revised digital brochure designed for the upcoming gala's major donors. I downloaded the high-resolution document and felt a cold, bitter smile touch my lips. In a panicked attempt to legitimize my sudden, aggressive interference with the bank and the insurance providers, the public relations team had frantically rewritten the executive board directory. I was no longer just a silent treasurer. My name was now plastered across the second page in bold, elegant typography, officially introducing me as the Chief Financial Officer of the Foundation. They had fabricated a glowing biography for me, praising my meticulous oversight and deep commitment to the family's philanthropic vision. They were trying to publicly trap me in the lie, assuming that if they gave me a fancy title and public recognition, I would be too flattered or too intimidated to tear the structure down. They were trying to make me a highly visible accomplice. I immediately forwarded the new brochure to Naomi Pike. Her response arrived in my inbox exactly 4 minutes later. Her legal counsel was brilliant in its restraint. She ordered me to maintain my absolute silence. She explained that panicked people are inherently sloppy people. When manipulators realize their victim is not responding to standard emotional triggers, they escalate their tactics. They overcompensate. They create more fraudulent documents. They send more incriminating messages, and they weave far more elaborate lies. Naomi insisted that sometimes the most devastating thing you can do to a liar is simply let them keep talking, because they will inevitably hand you the exact rope needed to hang them. I followed her instructions perfectly. I did not panic about the vicious rumors circulating through my extended family. I did not rush to defend my sanity. I did not answer the phone to scream at my mother. I simply sat at my dining room table, sipping lukewarm water, and acted as a silent, invisible archivist. Every single venomous voicemail, every desperate text message from my sister, every fabricated public relations draft, and every threatening corporate directive from my father was carefully categorized, labeled, and dropped into my growing evidence file. They thought my silence meant they were breaking me down, slowly forcing the useless daughter back into her compliant shadow. They had absolutely no idea. They were just feeding ammunition directly into the hands of the person who was about to execute them. Late Wednesday evening. The heavy wooden door of my apartment echoed with 3 sharp knocks. I unlatched the deadbolt to find Lorraine standing in the dimly lit hallway, clutching a battered cardboard storage box securely against her chest. She did not offer a warm, familial greeting. She simply pushed past me, walked directly to my dining room table, and set the heavy container down among my scattered legal pads. She explained, her voice low and steady, that this box had been held in a highly secure vault at my grandmother June's former accounting firm, guarded by a strict set of legal instructions that even my father could not override or charm his way past. The air in the room grew incredibly still as I took a pair of scissors and sliced through the yellowed packing tape. Inside the box lay a collection of faded manila folders, a thick leather-bound financial ledger, and a small silver microcassette recorder resting inside a protective velvet sleeve. I reached for the heavy ledger first. The pages were filled with my grandmother's impeccably neat, slanted handwriting. It was not a record of her corporate clients or her standard tax filings. It was a meticulous, devastatingly clear accounting of our family's hidden financial history. Column after column documented the staggering amounts of quiet financial support my parents had extracted from June to fund Delaney's endless whims while my grandmother was still alive. There were entries detailing tens of thousands of dollars wired to cover elite preparatory school tuitions, emergency cash infusions to settle Delaney's early, reckless credit card debts, and massive checks written to secure premium housing for her various out-of-state internships. Next to these exorbitant figures were small, sharp notes written in the margins, expressing June's growing alarm at my parents' utter failure to teach Delaney any concept of consequence or boundary. I flipped through dozens of pages, desperately searching for my own name. It appeared exactly twice, both times noting modest savings bonds purchased for my graduation. The stark disparity laid out in cold, hard ink was suffocating. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up the silver recorder. I pressed the heavy mechanical play button, and the low hiss of the tape filled the quiet room. Then, a voice I had not heard in years broke the silence. It was June. Her tone was raspy, authoritative, and profoundly kind. She began by stating the date of the recording, indicating she had made it shortly before her health completely failed. She addressed me directly, stating that if I was listening to this tape, I had reached 30 years old, the exact age she deemed me ready to carry the full weight of her true legacy. Her recorded words systematically dismantled every lie my parents had ever told me about my own worth within that house. June stated clearly that she saw exactly how I was treated. She saw the quiet erasure. She saw me being molded into a convenient, unpaid servant while my sister was polished into a fragile crown jewel. She explained that she had intentionally left Mercer Hall solely in my control, because I was the only person in the family who actually understood the immense value of building something sustainable. She recalled the community center designs I had once sketched out for her, validating the very dream my mother had so cruelly mocked. June said she knew Delaney would always be bailed out by my parents, no matter the catastrophic cost. Therefore, I was the one who needed absolute ironclad legal protection. Mercer Hall was not just a building. It was my armor against a family that would inevitably try to consume my future. The tape clicked to a loud stop, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. Lorraine reached into one of the manila folders and slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a certified mail receipt, obtained by Lorraine's own attorney during a highly contested routine audit of the estate filings. The document proved definitively that the primary estate executor had formally notified my parents about the specific successor trustee addendum exactly 2 years ago. My breath caught painfully in my throat. 2 years ago. They had known the absolute truth long before I reached my 30th birthday. They had stared directly at the legal reality that Mercer Hall belonged entirely to me, and they had consciously chosen to bury it. But the betrayal was far more sinister than mere concealment. Realizing that the clock was rapidly ticking toward the day I would legally assume control of the property, my father had accelerated his fraudulent schemes. They had aggressively leveraged my hidden equity, taking out that massive commercial mortgage to plug the disastrous financial holes left by Delaney's failed luxury lifestyle brand. They had actively stolen my future to pay for her past, hoping they could cleanly rebrand the heavily indebted building into a fake charity before I ever discovered the trust addendum existed. The sheer, crushing weight of this calculated theft was still settling into my bones when my apartment buzzer rang violently the following morning. It was Thursday, just 2 days before the scheduled gala. I opened the door to find Delaney pacing erratically in the hallway. Her expensive designer coat was unbuttoned, her hair was uncharacteristically messy, and the glossy, confident facade she wore for the cameras had completely shattered into desperate pieces. She pushed her way into my living room without an invitation, her voice high and frantic. She begged me to call the vendors, to release the electronic signatures, to stop ruining her life. She claimed the entire charity launch was collapsing, that the board members were demanding emergency audits, and that high-net-worth investors were threatening to pull their financial pledges. I did not offer her a glass of water. I did not offer her a seat. I stood perfectly still, a solid wall of ice, and looked at the sister I had spent my entire life quietly serving. I asked her one highly specific question. I asked her if she knew about the true ownership structure of Mercer Hall. Delaney froze instantly. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, desperately searching for an exit strategy or a convenient lie that simply did not exist. When she finally spoke, her voice dropped to a pathetic, defensive whisper. She confessed that she had overheard our parents having several heated, panicked arguments about the building's legal complications. She admitted she knew there was a severe problem with the title, and that my name was somehow deeply entangled in the financial mess. Then why did you proceed with the gala? I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm and hollow. Why did you stand on a brightly lit stage and claim my architectural designs as your own if you knew the entire foundation was corrupted? Her answer was the ultimate sickening distillation of everything fundamentally wrong with our family. She started crying, producing actual, genuine tears of intense self-pity. She sobbed that she had been struggling so much since her lifestyle brand publicly collapsed. The charity was her only chance to gracefully re-enter high society, to secure her public image, to be seen as a visionary leader rather than a failed entrepreneur. She said she deliberately chose not to ask our parents for the exact details, because she was absolutely terrified that knowing the truth would force her to cancel the massive photo opportunities and the glossy magazine interviews. She cared more about the elegant lighting and the applause than the absolute destruction of my life. She knew I was being sacrificed, and she simply looked the other way so she could keep dancing in the spotlight. I calmly walked over to the front door and held it wide open, refusing to say another word until she finally stopped crying, wiped her face, and walked out into the hallway. When the door clicked shut behind her, locking her out, the final piece of my emotional transformation locked firmly into place inside my chest. I walked back to my dining room table and looked at the towering stacks of financial documents, the forged vendor contracts, and the silver microcassette recorder. The lingering, pathetic hope that this was all just a terrible series of tragic misunderstandings evaporated completely into the cold air. This was never a story about a daughter crying over a forgotten birthday dinner. The empty chairs at the restaurant were merely a symptom of a much deadlier disease. This was a highly organized, generational embezzlement scheme wrapped neatly in the sacred, untouchable word of family. They had weaponized my loyalty, stolen my inheritance, and expected me to politely thank them for the privilege of being ruined. They thought I was the obedient, useless shadow, but they were about to learn exactly what happens when the shadow finally decides to swallow the entire room. The Founders' Ball was scheduled to commence precisely at 8 o'clock on a crisp Saturday evening. The location was, of course, Mercer Hall. When I finally stepped out of my hired car and looked up at the massive historic property, the sheer audacity of my family's deception was illuminated by dozens of rented industrial spotlights. The old brick facade had been subjected to a rapid, incredibly expensive cosmetic facelift. Premium silk banners cascaded from the second-story windows, proudly displaying the sleek, minimalist logo of my sister's fraudulent foundation. The grand entrance was flanked by towering floral installations of imported white orchids and cascading ivy. It was a breathtaking visual spectacle, meticulously engineered for the flashing cameras and the high-definition live broadcast feed. But I knew the anatomy of that building better than anyone. I knew that beneath the heavy velvet drapery, the original iron pipes were still rusting. I knew the freshly painted plaster was simply masking deep structural fractures. The entire venue was nothing more than a beautiful, hollow shell, propped up by stolen money and desperate lies. It was a flawless, physical manifestation of the Carmichael family itself. My parents had spent the final 48 hours leading up to the gala executing a brilliant and entirely ruthless public relations maneuver. When I had mysteriously stopped fighting their demands and allowed my official response to change to a confirmed attendance, they immediately interpreted my silence as total submission. They genuinely believed their campaigns of intimidation and vicious gossip had successfully broken my spirit. Operating under this profound delusion, they began working the elite social circles of the city. They proudly announced to every wealthy donor, every local politician, and every lifestyle journalist that I would be attending as the brilliant, silent co-founder of the community initiative. They weaponized my historical quietness, seamlessly turning my long-standing invisibility into a deliberate, noble choice. They told the press that I preferred the background, that I was the quiet architect of the family vision, while Delaney was the radiant face. By forcing this narrative, they transformed my anticipated silence at the gala into a public endorsement of their crimes. They believed that by granting me a meaningless, honorary title in front of the cameras, they had successfully purchased my permanent legal complicity. What my parents absolutely failed to comprehend was that my attendance was not a surrender. It was a highly orchestrated, legally binding condition meticulously designed by Naomi Pike. We needed them standing proudly in the very center of their glittering empire, surrounded by the exact people they intended to defraud, when we finally severed the load-bearing pillars of their scheme. while my sister spent the entire afternoon inside a luxury hotel suite, obsessively rehearsing her tearful speech about the unbreakable power of sisterhood and the heavy burden of shared dreams. A fleet of private legal couriers was being dispatched across the city. Precisely at 7 o'clock in the evening, as the first string quartet began to play in the grand lobby of Mercer Hall, heavy, wax-sealed envelopes were being hand-delivered to highly specific targets. These were not party invitations. They were comprehensive, heavily notarized legal packets containing the absolute truth. One package arrived at the private residence of the regional bank vice president who held the massive commercial mortgage. Another was signed for by the senior claims adjuster at the corporate insurance firm underwriting the massive event. The most devastating package, however, was routed directly to the emergency weekend contact at the State Department of Charitable Registrations, containing the certified trust addendum that proved Delaney had absolutely no legal authority to operate a charity on my property. We were quietly locking every single exit door from the outside while the orchestra played on the inside. I walked through the heavy brass doors of Mercer Hall. The atmosphere inside was intoxicatingly thick with expensive perfume, the clinking of crystal champagne flutes, and the low, vibrant hum of old money. Everything felt far too beautiful, stretched so incredibly tight that the air itself vibrated with the sickening frequency of glass right before it shatters into 1,000 pieces. I moved through the crowded room smoothly, observing the predators in their natural habitat. I did not look like a victim. I did not possess the frantic, unhinged energy of a deeply wounded woman arriving to scream for justice or beg for validation. I wore a tailored, midnight blue evening gown that felt entirely like a suit of armor. My posture was perfectly straight, my expression completely unreadable, and my heartbeat was a slow, steady drum in my chest. Across the massive room, I spotted Arthur Penhaligon. The elderly anchor donor was not mingling with the politicians or admiring the ice sculptures. He was standing near the designated pledging tables, flanked by 2 of his own private financial advisors. Following a highly discreet communication from Naomi earlier that afternoon, Arthur had formally demanded to review the raw, unedited financial dossiers before he allowed the massive pledge drive to officially commence. My father was currently standing next to him, sweating profusely through his custom-tailored tuxedo, frantically trying to stall Arthur with glasses of vintage wine and loud, boisterous laughter. My father's eyes darted nervously toward the exit, sensing a shift in the current but entirely unable to identify the source of the leak. As the hour approached 8 o'clock, the stage manager began directing the executive board toward the velvet-draped backstage area to prepare for the opening remarks. I followed the usher, taking my assigned place in the deep shadows just behind the heavy stage curtains. Delaney was standing a few feet away, taking deep, dramatic breaths while a professional makeup artist applied a final layer of translucent powder to her glowing cheeks. She looked like a perfect, triumphant queen, completely oblivious to the fact that the ground beneath her designer heels was already giving way. She was practicing her manufactured tears, preparing to tell a room full of millionaires how hard she had worked to build a community space, completely ignoring the fact that she had stolen the blueprints from my own mind. The heavy scent of jasmine perfume filled the narrow hallway. My mother materialized from the darkness of the backstage corridor. She was vibrating with a toxic mixture of high society anxiety and absolute arrogance. She saw me standing there, silent and completely still, and clearly assumed I had finally been beaten back into my proper, subservient shape. She stepped directly into my personal space, her eyes scanning my dress with a critical, dismissive glare. She did not offer a single word of gratitude for my presence. She did not ask how I was holding up under the immense pressure of the evening. Instead, she leaned in incredibly close, her perfectly painted lips brushing against the air right next to my ear. Her voice was a sharp, hissing whisper, dripping with decades of unchecked disdain and casual cruelty. "Try not to look so miserable when the cameras pan to you tonight," she ordered, her fingers digging sharply into my bare arm. "For once in your life, be useful." I did not pull my arm away. I turned my head slowly, meeting her cold, calculating gaze with absolute, terrifying clarity. I did not flinch. I did not look away. The desperate, accommodating daughter she thought she was commanding was gone. I offered her a very small, perfectly polite smile, the kind that appears when the outcome is already decided. "Tonight, I will," I replied simply. The grand ballroom of Mercer Hall plunged into total darkness exactly at 8:15 in the evening. A collective hush fell over the 300 wealthy guests seated at the lavishly decorated tables. Then a massive digital projection screen descended slowly from the vaulted ceiling. A swelling orchestral score filled the room, perfectly engineered to evoke a deep sense of historical nostalgia and emotional resonance. The screen flickered to life, projecting a beautifully edited montage of sepia-toned photographs and dramatic drone footage of the building exterior. A rich professional voiceover began narrating the tragic, entirely fabricated tale of the Carmichael family legacy falling into disrepair, followed immediately by the triumphant cinematic return of my younger sister. The video boldly titled itself "The Incredible Journey of Delaney Saving Our Heritage." It was an absolute masterpiece of emotional manipulation. The highly produced film completely erased the crushing commercial debt my parents had secretly accumulated over the years and successfully painted my sister as a solitary visionary savior rescuing a lost architectural treasure from ruin. When the video concluded, the heavy velvet curtains swept open, and a single brilliant white spotlight hit the exact center of the stage. Delaney stepped out from the shadows, draped in her custom emerald silk evening gown, looking incredibly fragile and impossibly brave. The audience erupted into rapturous applause. She walked slowly to the clear acrylic podium, gripping the edges with perfectly manicured hands, and began delivering a speech she had obsessively rehearsed for weeks. She spoke passionately about the architectural soul of the historic building, gesturing gracefully toward the high vaulted ceilings as if she had personally laid the original brickwork. She detailed the intricate community mentorship programs and the artisan galleries, describing my exact stolen blueprints with absolute terrifying conviction. She claimed Mercer Hall was the pure culmination of her deeply personal vision, a beautiful dream she had supposedly carried since childhood. In a 10-minute address, she managed to completely vaporize my existence, turning my intellectual property into her own glittering crown while the wealthy audience wiped tears from their eyes. My father followed her to the microphone a few moments later. He adjusted his expensive tuxedo jacket, projecting the absolute confidence of a patriarch who firmly believed he had outsmarted the entire world. He placed a heavy theatrical hand on Delaney's shoulder, smiling brightly out at the sea of wealthy donors and local politicians. He spoke grandly of family unity and shared sacrifice. Then, with a condescending chuckle that echoed loudly through the premium sound system, he finally acknowledged my physical presence standing in the shadows, just off the center stage. He raised his crystal wine glass and offered a public toast to his older daughter, thanking me for diligently handling all the boring, tedious paperwork behind the scenes. The audience offered a polite, murmuring laugh in response. It was a calculated, deliberate strike. He thought he was putting the useless shadow back into her tiny, manageable box, publicly cementing my permanent role as the silent clerk while they absorbed the absolute glory. He had no idea that the solid ground beneath his expensive leather shoes was already gone. From my elevated vantage point on the stage, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire ballroom. I bypassed the smiling faces and locked my eyes intently on the primary VIP table, located directly in the center of the room. The chairman of the foundation board was not looking at the stage or clapping his hands. He was staring down at a thick, heavily bound legal dossier resting right next to his untouched dinner plate. It was the exact package my lawyer had ordered her private couriers to deliver just hours prior. I watched the blood completely drain from his face as he rapidly turned the first page. His hands began to tremble slightly. He leaned over and whispered something urgently to the chief legal counsel sitting directly beside him. The lawyer grabbed the document, scanning the heavily notarized trust addendum, and his jaw visibly tightened in absolute horror. The structural panic was beginning to spread outward from their table like dark poison dropped into a clear glass of water. At the very back of the ballroom, the heavy oak entrance doors swung open with a quiet, ominous weight. Two figures stepped silently into the dimly lit foyer. They did not wear expensive evening gowns or tailored tuxedos. One was a man in a sharp, severely tailored gray suit, carrying a heavy leather briefcase, instantly recognizable as a senior investigative representative from the regional bank. The woman standing beside him wore a dark professional blazer with a bright silver investigative badge pinned clearly to her lapel. They belonged to the State Charitable Registration Division. They did not shout or interrupt the classical music playing softly in the background. They simply stood at the absolute perimeter of the room, their cold, assessing eyes sweeping over the lavish floral decorations. Wealthy people possess an incredibly acute intuition for institutional danger. The air in the back half of the room instantly grew ice cold. The quiet murmurs of polite conversation died away completely, replaced by a tense, suffocating silence that began rolling like a heavy fog toward the brightly lit stage. Oblivious to the encroaching legal disaster, the gala organizers transitioned seamlessly into the primary fundraising portion of the evening. The Master of Ceremonies enthusiastically announced the opening of the multi-million-dollar pledge drive. He gestured grandly toward Arthur Penhaligon, the elderly anchor donor whose massive financial commitment was entirely necessary to validate the newly formed charity in the eyes of the public. A young usher rushed a cordless microphone over to Arthur's table, clearly expecting a glowing endorsement and the announcement of a massive check. Arthur took the microphone, but he did not open his expensive leather checkbook. He stood up very slowly, leaning heavily on his carved wooden cane. The entire room went completely, terrifyingly still. Arthur ignored my father completely. He ignored Delaney and her beautiful emerald dress. He looked directly up at me standing in the shadows. His voice resonated loudly through the massive speakers, sharp and commanding, entirely devoid of the usual high society pleasantries. He addressed me clearly by my full name. He stated to the silent room that the recently circulated public relations brochure listed me as the chief financial officer of the organization. More importantly, he noted that certain newly discovered public property records strongly suggested I held the true legal title of successor co-trustee for Mercer Hall itself. He looked around the silent room, pointing a weathered finger directly toward the stage. He demanded, clearly and forcefully on the open microphone, that I personally verify the absolute legal standing of the organization, confirm the ethical allocation of the proposed operational budget, and guarantee that the fundraising campaign was operating under legitimate, uncorrupted authority before one single dollar was pledged by anyone sitting in that room. The tension in the air snapped like a thick piano wire. The silence that immediately followed his demand was absolute, terrifying, and profound. 300 pairs of eyes shifted instantly from the wealthy patriarch to the silent, supposedly useless daughter standing quietly in the shadows. Delaney's radiant, confident smile froze entirely, transforming into a rigid, terrified grimace as her knuckles turned stark white against the lucite podium. My father's smug expression dissolved rapidly into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. He stepped forward quickly, reaching desperately for the main microphone to intercept the question and control the narrative. But the audio engineer at the back of the room had already cut his microphone feed. I looked down into the front row. My mother was standing up, her chair pushed back violently against the linen-covered table. Her eyes were wide, manic, and absolutely furious. She was glaring up at me, her face contorted in a desperate, ugly rage. She nodded her head sharply, violently, mouthing an aggressive command for me to smile, to nod my head, to play my assigned role and save their glittering, fraudulent empire from total collapse. She demanded with her eyes that I absorb the massive damage, just as I had done every single day of my entire life. I did not nod. I stepped completely out of the shadows and walked slowly, deliberately toward the center of the brightly lit stage. I took the microphone from the tall metal stand. The cold metal felt heavy and solid in my hand. I looked directly at the bank representative standing at the back doors. I looked at the panicked board chairman sweating at his table. I looked down at my mother, watching the absolute, crushing terror finally register in her eyes as she realized the invisible cage I had built around them had just locked firmly shut. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream or cry or show a single ounce of fear. I spoke very clearly into the microphone, letting my words echo through the massive brick hall, and I chose to say the exact opening sentence that made the entire evening slip permanently out of their desperate hands. I stared directly into the blinding glare of the theatrical spotlights and spoke with absolute, unwavering clarity. I told the completely silent room that I was not the chief financial officer of this philanthropic foundation. I stated that I had never attended a single executive board meeting. I had never approved a single promotional campaign, and every digital signature attached to the massive vendor contracts for this extravagant evening was a complete, deliberate forgery. The air in the ballroom seemed to vanish all at once. Then, I delivered the final, fatal blow to their structural foundation. I announced that according to the heavily notarized trust addendum executed by my late grandmother, I was the sole legal successor co-trustee of Mercer Hall. The historic property they were currently standing inside did not belong to a charitable trust. It belonged entirely to me, and I had never granted legal permission for its use. Right on cue, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom opened wide. Naomi Pike walked straight down the center aisle. She did not rush. She moved with the terrifying, predatory grace of a legal executioner. She bypassed the sprawling guest tables and approached the primary VIP section. She handed the certified copies of the original trust documents directly to the chairman of the board. She handed another heavily bound folder to the senior bank investigator who had followed her into the room. The chairman looked down at the documents, his face turning an ashen, sickly shade of gray. He immediately raised a shaking hand, signaling frantically to the audio engineers to cut all upbeat background music. The bank investigator did not wait for permission to speak. He stepped forward and declared in a loud, authoritative voice that all commercial credit lines associated with the gala were frozen effective immediately due to gross financial misrepresentation. The state investigator, the woman with the silver badge pinned to her lapel, stepped up right beside him. She formally ordered the immediate cessation of all fundraising activities in the building. She demanded that every single piece of promotional material bearing my forged name be collected and surrendered as active evidence in a formal state inquiry. The collapse of the evening was instantaneous and absolute. Arthur Penhaligon, the elderly anchor donor who had demanded the truth, simply nodded his head once in my direction. He buttoned his expensive wool coat, turned his back on my father, and began walking calmly toward the exit. He did not shout or make a dramatic scene. He simply left, and exactly like water rushing through a broken concrete dam, the rest of the wealthy donors followed him. Hundreds of millionaires, local politicians, and influential socialites stood up in near-perfect unison. They were leaving not because of a noisy family argument, but because they understood with absolute clarity that they had just witnessed a massive, undeniable system of fraud being cleanly dissected by incontrovertible paperwork. They wanted absolutely no part of the sinking ship. On the brightly lit stage, the Carmichael family facade violently disintegrated. Delaney dropped her fragile, inspiring victim persona entirely. She began shrieking, her voice echoing shrilly through the rapidly emptying hall. She physically turned on our parents, waving her arms frantically and screaming that they had promised her the legal issues were resolved. She blamed them entirely for her public humiliation, proving in a matter of seconds that her loyalty only extended exactly as far as her own convenience. My mother completely lost her mind. She lunged forward from the front row, her face twisted into an ugly, unrecognizable mask of pure hatred. She screamed at the top of her lungs, completely ignoring the fact that several news cameras were still rolling at the back of the room. She yelled that I was a monster, a jealous, vindictive child who had spent my entire life trying to destroy my own flesh and blood. She demanded that someone arrest me, her words slurring together in a panicked, irrational frenzy of misplaced blame. But it was my father's reaction that cemented my absolute victory. The man who had spent his entire life dominating every room, the man who firmly believed he could talk his way out of any consequence, was completely paralyzed. He stood frozen next to the empty pledging tables, staring blankly at the certified legal documents resting in the hands of the bank investigator. His mouth opened and closed, but absolutely no sound came out. He finally understood that his arrogant charm and his corporate intimidation were utterly useless against cold, hard evidence. There was absolutely no narrative he could spin to talk over the irrefutable truth printed on those pages. I walked to the very edge of the stage, looking down at the three people who had spent decades turning me into a convenient ghost. The microphone was still live, and my voice cut through my mother's hysterical screaming with quiet, lethal precision. "You missed my birthday 3 years in a row because you thought I was the daughter who would always absorb the cost," I said, making sure every single syllable landed like a heavy stone. I was never useless. I was the one protecting all of you from consequences. I handed the microphone to a stunned stagehand, turned my back on the screaming woman who gave birth to me, and walked out the side door of Mercer Hall into the cool, quiet night air. The fallout over the next several weeks was absolute and highly publicized. The state attorney general launched a massive corporate fraud investigation into my father's business holdings. The fake charity was immediately dissolved by the state registry, and the regional banks began aggressive foreclosure proceedings on my parents' primary residential estate to recover the stolen commercial loan funds. Delaney fled the city entirely, moving to a completely different coast to escape the relentless mockery of the local press, her carefully curated reputation completely and permanently destroyed. With Naomi Pike managing the aggressive legal maneuvers, I officially reclaimed absolute operational control of Mercer Hall. I spent the first month hiring a professional demolition crew to strip away the cheap, superficial cosmetic repairs my family had installed for their fake gala. We tore down the expensive silk banners and the temporary drywall, exposing the beautiful, incredibly strong original brickwork underneath. I fired every single corrupt vendor associated with my family and hired honest local contractors to begin building the real, authentic vision I had designed all those years ago. It took a significant amount of time, but Mercer Hall slowly transformed into a vibrant, fully funded community arts center and vocational training space. I officially named it the June Mercer Foundation, finally honoring the only woman in my family who had ever truly seen my worth. Exactly 1 year later, I turned 32 years old. I did not book a table at a fancy rooftop restaurant. I did not sit in an empty leather booth, waiting for people who would never arrive. Instead, I celebrated inside the main gallery of Mercer Hall. The large industrial windows let in the warm evening light, illuminating a room slightly packed with people. Lorraine was there, laughing loudly and pouring expensive wine. Naomi Pike stood near the catering table, offering a rare, genuine smile as she spoke with the new foundation directors. Arthur Penhaligon had stopped by specifically to shake my hand and admire the newly finished youth mentorship workshops. The room was incredibly loud, filled with the brilliant, messy energy of a community that I had built with my own 2 hands. I looked around the crowded space, listening to the upbeat music and the genuine laughter echoing off the historic brick walls. I realized in that beautiful moment that my phone could stay completely silent all night long, and I would not care at all. The people standing around me had come voluntarily. They did not need to be reminded by a digital calendar notification. They did not need to be bribed with expensive gifts or catered food. And most importantly, I did not have to fix their massive problems, balance their bleeding ledgers, or act as their silent, invisible shield to earn my rightful place in the room. I did not have to be useful to be completely, unconditionally loved. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please comment below to let me know where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts. And I invite you to subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.